All right, ready to dive into a bit of a philosophical rabbit hole because today we're tackling change, something we experience constantly, yet struggle to truly define. And to add a layer of complexity, we're going to approach this as if we're explaining it to a philosopher. Think you're up for the challenge?
It's a deceptively simple concept that quickly spirals into some seriously complex territory. Luckily, we have the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on change and inconsistency to guide us.
Excellent point. We're not just talking about the weather changing, we're going deep into the philosophical nuts and bolts of what it means for something to change. Like, how can something be the same thing if its properties are different at different times? It's like that old saying, you can't step in the same river twice.
Exactly. That gets to the heart of the problem of identity over time. Let's say you have a favorite coffee mug that you use every morning. Over time, it might get chipped, the color might fade, but you still call it the same mug. But philosophically, is it really the same if its properties have changed?
Now, that's a question that's probably kept philosophers up at night for centuries. And speaking of philosophers, I think it's time we travel back in time to ancient Greece and meet one of the biggest skeptics of change, Parmenides.
Parmenides, he basically argued that change is an illusion, his reasoning. Real things can't pop in and out of existence if something is, it always was and always will be. Change to him implied a contradiction, which he believed was impossible.
Okay, so Parmenides is saying that change can't be real because it would mean something becomes something different from what it was, which just doesn't compute for him. But how did other philosophers build on this?
Well, his student Zeno took this idea and crafted a series of famous paradoxes to illustrate the problem of change and motion. You might have heard of Zeno's paradox of the
Oh,
arrow.
yes, the one where an arrow is frozen in time at each point in its flight. So how could it be moving if it's always at rest? It's a real head scratcher. But before we get too deep into Zeno's paradoxes, I think it's worth noting how this idea of change as an illusion plays out in other philosophical traditions.
Absolutely. Let's fast forward a few centuries to the Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti. He took a radical approach and said if something has different properties at different times, then it can't be the same thing. He believed reality was a series of ultra-fast snapshots, like a cosmic flipbook, with each moment being distinct. This is the Buddhist doctrine of moments.
So rather than a continuous flow of time, Dharmakirti envisioned reality as a series of distinct static moments. Our lives are a film reel with each frame representing a different moment. Now, that's a way to visualize change.
Mhm.
But where does this leave us with the problem of identity over time? If every moment is different, how can we even talk about something persisting?
Dharmakirti's view does challenge our usual way of thinking about identity. He argued that what we perceive as a single enduring entity is actually a series of causally connected moments. Think of it like a chain. Each link is distinct, but they're connected to form a whole.
Interesting analogy. So each moment is unique, but linked to the previous and next one, creating a flow of existence. It's almost like each moment gives birth to the next, even if they're not exactly the same. This raises a really intriguing question for our philosopher friend. If everything is in constant flux, does that mean there's no such thing as a stable self?
That's a question that has puzzled philosophers for ages, and it's one we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into different philosophical perspectives on change.
Okay, so we've gone from change as an illusion to change as a series of moments.
Hmm.
I'm starting to see how complex this seemingly simple concept really is, but we can't talk about change without mentioning a philosopher who embraced contradiction, Hegel.
Yes, Hegel. He had a unique perspective claiming that contradiction was the engine of change. He even said, something moves not because at one moment of time it is here and at another there, but because at one the same moment it is here and not here.
Wait, hold on. Here and not here at the same time?
Ah!
That sounds like a logical impossibility. How can something be in two places at once?
Hegel was all about embracing contradictions, believing they were fundamental to reality, and drove all development and progress for him. Change wasn't a smooth transition, but a constant clash of opposites.
Okay, I'm going to need an example here because my brain is starting to feel a bit fried.
Think about a seed becoming a plant. It's not simply a gradual transformation. The seed has to essentially die to give rise to the plant. There's a contradiction inherent in the process. The seed is both itself and not itself as it changes.
So it's like the seed is simultaneously existing and not existing as it transforms into a plant. That's a pretty radical way to think about change. But I think I'm starting to grasp how Hegel saw contradiction as the driving force behind it.
Exactly. And this concept applies to many areas, not just plant life. Think about personal growth. You have to let go of old beliefs and habits to embrace new ones. There's a period of tension and contradiction as you change.
So for Hegel, change isn't just about things moving from one state to another. It's about a fundamental clash of opposites that drives transformation. It makes you realize that change often involves a bit of chaos and uncertainty, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that brings us to another crucial point. How do we even reconcile our experience of continuous change with the idea of time being composed of individual static moments?
Right, because we don't experience life as a series of snapshots. It feels like a smooth, continuous flow. So how do we bridge that gap?
Well, one philosopher who tackled this was Georg von Wright. He explored the idea of time as a series of nested intervals rather than a collection of discrete points, and he suggested that change might involve a kind of denseness of contradictory states within these intervals.
Okay, denseness of contradictory states. Now you're just showing off your philosophical vocabulary. Can you break that down for us simple folk?
Imagine you're looking at an hour-long period where it's raining. Von Wright argued that within that hour, there are smaller and smaller intervals where it's both raining and not raining. Think of it as a fuzzy, indeterminate zone where both states exist simultaneously.
So it's not like there's a precise moment when the rain starts or stops. It's more of a gradual blend of both states.
Precisely. Von Wright suggested this denseness of contradictory states might be how we make sense of continuous change in a world where time isn't neatly divided into points. It's like mixing two colors of paint. There's a blurry transitional zone where both colors are present before they fully blend.
That's a helpful analogy. So rather than seeing change as a series of distinct on and off switches, it's more like a dimmer switch with infinite settings between raining and not raining.
Exactly. It's a way to bridge the gap between our experience of continuous change and the seemingly static nature of individual moments.
This whole discussion is making me appreciate just how much philosophy is needed to understand something as basic as change. And I think it's fair to say that we've only just scratched the surface here. Where do we go from here on this philosophical roller coaster ride?
Well, get ready to buckle up because next we're diving into the world of dialetheism with Graham Priest, a contemporary philosopher who argues that some contradictions are actually true, and guess what? He believes change is one of them.
True contradictions? I have a feeling this is where things get really interesting.
True contradictions indeed. Priest's view might sound a bit mind-boggling at first, but bear with us, remember, we're trying to explain this to a philosopher, and they're usually up for a good mind-bending challenge.
Challenge accepted. So tell me more about this dialetheism thing. How can contradictions be true? Doesn't that defy basic logic?
It does challenge classical logic, which relies on the principle of non-contradiction, that something can't be both true and false at the same time. But Priest argues that there are certain situations, particularly when dealing with change, where contradictions are unavoidable and even necessary to accurately describe reality.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but still a bit skeptical.
Give me an example where a contradiction might actually be true.
Think about the classic liar paradox. This statement is false. If the statement is true, then it's false, and if it's false, then it must be true. It creates an inescapable contradiction. Priest argues that this isn't just a linguistic quirk, but it points to a deeper truth about the nature of self-reference and potentially about reality itself.
So he's saying that paradoxes like this reveal limitations in our traditional ways of thinking about truth and falsehood.
Exactly. And Priest believes these limitations become especially apparent when we try to grapple with the concept of change. He starts by critiquing what he calls the cinematic view of change, the idea that an object in motion is simply occupying different positions in space at different times, like frames in a film, right? Like a flip book or a series of snapshots. Each frame is static, but when you run them together quickly, you get the illusion of movement.
Precisely. But Priest argues that this view falls short because it can't explain how or why the object moves from one point to another. It just describes a series of states without capturing the actual process of transitioning between those states.
So it's like saying a ball went from point A to point B without explaining how it got there. It's missing the crucial in-between part of the story.
Right. And he brings back Zeno's paradox of the arrow to make this point. If the arrow is truly at rest at every single instant, how can it ever actually move? Like an infinite series of zero movements. Shouldn't that still add up to zero movement overall?
That darn arrow keeps coming back to haunt us. It really highlights the difficulty of reconciling our experience of smooth, continuous motion with the idea of time being chopped up into static points.
Exactly. And this is where Priest's dialetheism comes in. He proposes a bold solution. Motion is actually inconsistent, meaning a moving object both occupies a specific point in space and doesn't occupy that point at the same time. This inherent contradiction, he claims, is what drives the object's movement.
Whoa, wait a minute. Is he saying that moving objects are somehow smeared across space like a blurry photograph?
You're on the right track.
Hmm.
He suggests that moving objects occupy a small lozenge of space that encompasses all the positions they take within a corresponding lozenge of time.
Yeah.
It's not just that they're in multiple places at once, but also in multiple moments at once. This spread across space-time is what gives rise to the perception of movement.
Okay, my brain is definitely doing some heavy lifting here. But how does this account for objects that are not moving?
According to Priest, a body is motionless if there's no contradiction in its position at a given time. It's only when it starts moving that this inconsistency kicks in. It's like the object is stretched across space-time when it moves, creating this paradoxical state of both being and not being in a specific location at a specific time.
So stillness is consistent, while motion is inherently inconsistent. It's almost like motion is a kind of glitch in the fabric of reality, a place where the usual rules break down.
That's a poetic way to put it. And Priest even suggests that this glitch might be the key to understanding some of the mysteries of quantum mechanics. Remember all those weird things like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and quantum entanglement?
Oh, yes. The ones where particles can be in multiple states at once and somehow communicate instantaneously across vast distances.
Exactly. Priest proposes that the uncertainty of a particle's position might actually be due to its inconsistent smearing across space. It's not that we simply don't know where it is, it's that it is in multiple places at once, just like a moving object in his model.
Wow, so we've gone from ancient Greek paradoxes to potentially explaining the strangeness of the quantum world. That's a pretty impressive feat for a theory that embraces contradictions. But before we lose ourselves completely in the quantum realm, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the idea that even if change itself is consistent, our perception of change might involve inconsistencies. What does cognitive science have to say about that?
That's a great question. And it's something that the Stanford Encyclopedia also delves into research on motion perception, suggests that our brains might be using a kind of contradictory processing to make sense of moving objects.
So you're saying our brains might be playing tricks on us?
In a way, yes. One key mechanism seems to be the Reichardt detector, which compares information from different points in time and space to detect changes in an object's position. It's like our brains are constantly taking snapshots and then comparing them to see if something has moved.
Well, our brains are like miniature detectives constantly analyzing the scene for clues of motion.
That's a good way to put it. What's interesting is that these comparisons involve delaying signals from one point in time and then superimposing them onto signals from a later point in time.
That sounds suspiciously like the kind of denseness of contradictory states that von Wright was talking about.
It does, doesn't it? And this idea is further supported by the five phenomenon, where we perceive a single moving light when two stationary lights are flashed in rapid succession.
Oh yeah, I've seen that in those old school animation flip books. It's amazing how our brains can create the illusion of motion from still images.
Exactly. This suggests that our brains are actually identifying different things at different times as being the same thing, which could lead to contradictory representations. It's as if our brains are saying this light and that light are the same light, even though they're clearly in different positions.
So our brains might be little contradiction machines churning out inconsistent representations of a constantly changing world. It makes you wonder if our perception of reality is more fluid and less rigid than we often assume.
It certainly does. And this brings us back to our original mission. Explaining change to a philosopher, we've explored a range of perspectives, from those who see change as an illusion to those who embrace contradiction as its driving force. But what does it all mean? How do we make sense of this complex and ever-shifting world?
Yeah, it really is mind-blowing to think that something so basic like change has occupied philosophers for centuries, and we're still debating it today. We've gone from ancient Greece to the quantum realm, and honestly, I'm not sure if we've even scratched the surface of this topic.
And that's the beauty of philosophy. It's about asking these questions, exploring these different perspectives, and embracing the complexity of the world around us. There might not be one definitive answer to the question of what is change, but the process of grappling with it is where the real value lies.
I love that it's not about finding the right answer. It's about expanding our understanding and challenging our assumptions. But before we get too meta, I want to bring it back to our listener who's been patiently following along on this philosophical journey. What's the so what here? Why should any of this matter to their daily life?
That's a crucial question. I think a philosophical understanding of change can fundamentally shift the way we see the world and ourselves. For one thing, it can make us more aware of the impermanence of all things. We tend to cling to the idea of a stable self, a fixed identity that endures through time. But as we've seen, that idea is constantly challenged by the reality of change.
So rather than fearing change or trying to resist it, we might be better off embracing the fluidity of life, accepting that change is inevitable and even essential for growth.
Exactly. It can also make us more open to new experiences and less resistant to the inevitable transformations we all undergo. If change is the very essence of reality, then resisting it is ultimately futile.
That's a powerful insight. It almost makes change feel less like something to be feared and more like something to be embraced. It's like surfing a wave. You can't control the wave, but you can learn to ride it.
What a great analogy. And remember, change can be a source of creativity growth and even joy by understanding it philosophically. We can learn to navigate its complexities with more grace and wisdom.
I think this deep dive has definitely left me with a renewed appreciation for the ever-changing nature of reality. But as always, we like to leave our listeners with something to chew on, a final thought to spark further contemplation. So what's the lingering question that we should send our philosopher in training off with today?
Here's one. If the world is truly in constant flux, if everything is always changing, does that mean there's no such thing as a stable self? Are we just a series of fleeting moments, as Dharmakirti suggested, or is there some underlying continuity that binds those moments together? I encourage you to explore this question further, perhaps, by revisiting some of the philosophers and ideas we've discussed today.
That's a question that could keep us all thinking for a lifetime. And with that, we'll bring this deep dive into the philosophy of change to a close. Thanks for joining us on this mind-bending journey. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those thoughts evolving.